Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Wong, and I'm an author and assistant professor of creative writing in the English department at the University of Winnipeg. I'm a Chinese woman with blonde hair, and I want to welcome you to our very first event for 2024 for our publishing speaker series. And today we are featuring a Q&A with the wonderful literary agent, DongWon Song, who is a dream agent for many. Every time I go to the conference or festival, so many writers come up to me and say, I wish DongWon was my agent. That is who I want. And I'm like, oh, that's great because, DongWon is a specialist in science fiction and fantasy and horror. So they're very lucky if they're able to get representation from them. And today's event, as I mentioned previously, will be recorded. So if you do not want to be on camera, we ask that you keep your video off. Otherwise, you'll be on our English department website and we'll be able to point at you and look at you. We also ask that you keep your mics muted. We have a lot of questions submitted already, so we will only turn to the audience if there is time. And I want to thank the English department and the research office for supporting this event. And before we start, I'm going to give a land acknowledgement. Today, we acknowledge that we live and work in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations. The University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples. As a settler of color writer, I am not only committed to honoring and following the lead of the land, water, and cultural protectors of this space, but I also am a constant and forever student of the remarkable stories and their tellings by Indigenous peoples here and around the world. Thank you for the space, and I'm very grateful to everyone for joining us today. And if you feel moved to, please share where you're coming from in the chat on Zoom. So I'm very excited to now introduce you to the more formal bio of DongWon Song. DongWon Song is an agent at Howard Morham Literary Agency, representing science fiction and fantasy for adults, young adult, and middle grade readers, as well as select nonfiction. They were formerly an editor at Orbit, a product manager for ebook startup, and is taught at institutions including Portland State University and New York University. They have a newsletter about publishing at publishingishard.com. DongWon is Korean American, trans, and non-binary, and uses they, them pronouns. So please welcome DongWon. I'll clap. You can hear everyone clapping.
We can imagine the roaring. No, thank you so much for the incredibly gracious introduction and for inviting me to be here. It's very exciting to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. I was really excited when you said yes. So it's not often we get an agent who specializes in what you do.
Well, and it's always a pleasure to see you and catch up. So
it's always fun. So I'm just going to start with a very, I guess, general questions. Sure. So prior to being an agent, you've had a really varied and really amazing trajectory. You've worked as an editor, a product manager, and you've been a college professor. So some of our English creative writing students are graduating pretty soon. And if they wanted to follow your path, what should they do?
Well, my path in particular was very circuitous, as you've mentioned, right? I've worked at agencies. I've worked in-house at a publisher. I worked for an ebook startup for a while. I see actually one of my former colleagues from that startup in the chat. It's nice to see her here. And I have also taught. The teaching was sort of in addition to being an agent. That was sort of something I was doing sort of in my spare time, I guess. But, if you're looking to get into publishing, it really is like applying to any creative industry. There's a lot of interest in getting into publishing and not that many positions. So it can be quite challenging to get those initial jobs, right? So it requires a lot of meeting people and networking and trying to learn about opportunities as early as you can, and trying to get a personal introduction to the people who are hiring. Now, if that sounds incredibly difficult, it's because it is. There's so much competition for so few slots, but once you start getting into the network, once you start getting to know people, then that can really help in hearing about opportunities and getting in there. Aside from that, it's pretty standard in terms of like just having a clear cover letter and just being clear about why you want to be in this industry, what you want to be doing. Asking for informational interviews can also be really helpful. All these things can be time consuming, but if you really do want to work in the industry, sometimes that level of research and that level of effort can be helpful. Yeah, and the subtext of all this is that it is hard to get started in publishing if you're not living in a place where there are publishers, right? So if you're not in a major city, whether that's if you're in the US, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, a little bit LA, a little bit Portland, it's kind of hard to get a job without being in a place where there's a density of publishing people. I'm not quite sure. I think it's Toronto is the main publishing center in Canada. And so, being in one of these major cities can help a lot. Yeah, so hopefully that's somewhat helpful of an answer.
Yeah, I remember my internship days. They were
Mm-hmm.
long and grueling.
They are
Hmm.
long and grueling and not well paid in very expensive places, which creates like real structural problems in the industry, right? The reason we have issues still with diversity, with representation, inside publishing houses is it is frankly just hard to have the resources and the knowledge and the training to do everything that I'm talking about to get those jobs, right? To be able to live in New York City on very low pay for a period of time if you have student loans, if you're coming from a family that doesn't have intergenerational wealth, they can't support you in those ways, it can be very, very difficult. So that is just sort of saying the quiet part out loud.
Hmm. And I think there's a lot more remote opportunities nowadays
Yes.
as well, but they're still very competitive.
Yes.
Hmm.
There are more and more opportunities for remote, especially on the agenting side. Agenting is becoming more and more decentralized. Lots of agents are like moving out of New York because we can now. We don't have to be here as much as we used to be. In the in-person sort of socializing and networking opportunities just aren't as common as they used to be. So it's more viable to get your start remote. I think there's still some very serious challenges to doing so in terms of building up that initial network, getting to know your peers, all of those things, being close to where things are happening, at least for some part of the time, I think still can be very helpful, but it is now doable in a way that it didn't used to be.
Yeah, that's good to know. And what I found really interesting about publishing is it's one of those things where you have to really know everyone sometimes just to
Yeah.
get your start, right? As a writer, not so much because you can send queries from your
Hmm.
computer, but if you actually want to be an editor or an agent, it
Hmm.
actually means showing up and doing the
Yeah.
work. Hmm.
Even when you're querying, it helps to get to know some people, right? To have someone who can make that introduction for you, to give you a reference or something like that. Those things can give you an enormous leg up in this industry. So, unfortunately, so much of the business is about who not necessarily in a my dad went to Harvard with your dad way, but more in a just we've met at a conference, we had a chat at a book event, I remember you from this thing, or we're our Twitter mutuals, or I guess not so much Twitter anymore, but I don't know, wherever people are hanging out these days online, like if we're in a Discord together or whatever it is, all those things can be hugely helpful in getting started, whether you're trying to get started as a writer or on the publishing side. So networking, finding a writing group, these things are some of the most invaluable things you can do to help your career along, is being social, getting to know people. It's one of the great ironies of the writing business, which we think of as very solitary. But then to succeed at the publishing side, you need to be very social and very good at dealing with people.
Yeah. And that's why agents are there, right? To help us navigate
Exactly.
that, right? Once you get an
Exactly.
agent, then you can be
Exactly.
like, okay, I'm
Yep.
gonna hide in my room and let my agent do all the talking.
We help with that at least.
For
Yeah.
sure. And you're an agent who
Mhm.
specializes in spec fic, which is,
Yes.
I think, a lot of agents don't do that. And I'm just
Mhm.
wondering, if is it a general term that includes fantastical elements? Does it include, science fiction, fantasy, magical realism, or does it have some sort of special element that
Mhm.
separates it from genre fiction? So, what is spec fiction from your point of view?
Yeah. It can be kind of a blanket term sometimes. I think I use it sometimes just because it's easier than trying to say science fiction fantasy, which is so many words. Like honestly, I say speculative just because it's shorter and a little bit easier. It's a more modern term. I don't know when exactly people started using speculative, but it feels like in the last 10 years it's really taken off as a way to talk about things. And it is distinct a little bit from science fiction, fantasy, and horror, but it sort of incorporates elements of those. When we say speculative, we generally mean not for a genre audience, but for a mainstream audience, but has supernatural or science fictional elements to it, right? There, or some kind of surreality to it, often, which kind of blends into what we sometimes call magical realism, although that should really be limited to authors coming from sort of a Latinx background to sort of honor sort of like the very specific traditions that magical realism connotes. But books that have a surreal component, books that have a mystical component, but are for a mainstream audience, are for a more upmarket literary quote unquote audience. That's generally when we're saying speculative. In part, I think it's just to make a distinction between this is a science fiction as science fiction book for people who like to read that, right? So that's when you're going to one of the smaller science fiction publishers, smaller only relative to the size of the Simon and Schuster or Little Random or one of those sort of big mainstream imprints. Um, just to make the distinction of who are we targeting, who's our audience for this, right? So in terms of the actual reading experience, where the line between speculative and genre is very, very blurry. And I love playing with that line, pushing books right up to the edge of it, either on the speculative side or on the science fiction side, just to sort of like try and reach that, what we call the crossover audience, the audience that is open to reading either category.
Yeah. It's so interesting because sometimes marketing, they don't know where to categorize a book,
Yeah.
especially once you add
Mhm.
in the literary element, right? Is it literary
Yes.
fiction or is it genre fiction or is it spec? And
Yeah.
so often I think it's just a team of people being like, well, we'll try to, market it to everyone.
Exactly. And I think that's where you can almost get into more trouble is when you are trying to hit all audiences and you aren't specific about who it is you're trying to publish for, right? My own personal theory of publishing is that you can boil pretty much any question in the business down to who is this book for, right? What's on the cover? What's the copy? What's the title? How are we editing it? How are we marketing it? All of that is trying to identify who is the target audience for this book and how do we reach them. So when you're trying to say this book is for everybody, there's a very real way in which what you end up saying is this book is for nobody, because you're not approaching any specific person saying, hey, you who like this book, you who like to read this thing, come here and buy this, right? So you have to be specific in your marketing. You have to be specific in how you're talking about the book. But then you get into all kinds of sticky territory of like, when you have a book that's crossover, where do we put it? Does this go on the literary list? Does this go on the genre list? Is this horror or is this, like I have a book called Chlorine that is from a Chinese American writer. It's a really wonderful, dark story about a young woman who decides that she wants to become a mermaid. It's got a lot of body horror. It's a book about a teenage protagonist. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's an adult literary novel. It's a novel about somebody grappling with really difficult themes and topics from the perspective of an adult writer, not from the perspective of a teen in terms of the tonality and the voice and the subject matter. So figuring out where to put that book, which could have gone 4 different ways, whether that's fantasy, horror, literary fiction, YA, adult, there's all these different options. And so zeroing in on exactly how we were going to pitch that book was a very real challenge and leads to all kinds of conversations about what is genre, where do we put a book in terms of where it goes in the bookstore, how are people going to read and receive this book? All of those things are on the table, and we're trying to figure that out and really making our best judgment calls about what we think is the right way to publish a book. And sort of the blanket term for all of this is what we call positioning. And I think it's the most important concept in publishing, and you never hear anybody talk about it because it is so complicated to explain, as you can sort of see by my like rambling here. But figuring out the positioning of the book, I think, is the primary job of a publisher. And once they have that, then everything descends from those decisions.
Yeah, and that's really important. I also had a similar issue. I released a collection of immigrant horror stories as
Mhm.
well. And so I remember going back and forth and being like, well, what is this? Right. And I
Yeah.
think no one knew.
Yeah.
It's an
I
important
think you're
topic
very
that we need
much
to talk
someone who like lives on that line, right? Of, what is speculative, what is, literary, you have memoir, but in a very novelistic tone, and like all of these different things that come forward in your writing in terms of how you present yourself to the market. And I think what makes your work very exciting and engaging. But, you and I met initially at a science fiction conference, but you had just sold a memoir. So there was always like, wait, what's happening here? What are we doing? And I think that is exciting, but does present a career challenge in a lot of ways.
for
Yeah,
sure. And these are all really important questions to think about as we're writing, not just when we've finished the
absolutely.
book.
Hmm.
Mhm. Um, Well, this is a question I'm sure you get a lot. In my class, we're always talking about, the agent submission process from a writer's point of view. And being an agented author is tricky because we're not just hiring, an agent, right? But the
Yeah,
agent has to also choose you too, right? So
yeah.
it's a two-way process. And so from an agent's point of view, how do you know if a manuscript is the right fit for you? And can you
Hmm.
walk us through your process on how do you decide which clients to represent?
Totally. As one can imagine, it's not easy, right? It's very difficult to figure out. Not only do I like this book, is this book good, but is this the right client for me, right? There are plenty of books I read on submission that I'm like, this is a wonderful book. I either have no idea what to do with it, or I'm not the right agent for this, or a million other things that might go into that decision to not offer representation, or even to offer representation and to have a conversation with the author. And one or both of us realize, like, actually, this isn't the right fit. We should go a different direction, right? And so, one thing I love to encourage writers to think about is not to say yes just because someone else is offering, right? Don't take the first thing on the table just because you feel like you're never going to get another option. If somebody's offering, that usually means other people would be interested, right? That usually means that you are in a place where there is interest and energy, and you are doing something that you're close, right? You're getting there, right? And so, even if only one person is, if they're not the right fit for you, I really encourage you to be patient and maybe think about the next project, think about who the right person is, because no agent is always better than the wrong agent. The wrong agent can really complicate your career in a way that is difficult. And, it's very hard to hear when you're querying, when you're on that side of the line of trying to figure out who is the right agent. These are really tough decisions, and I'm very sympathetic to that. Anyways, getting back to sort of the more original question, for me, the things that really stand out when I'm considering, is this the right project for me, is can I see the author's point of view in the text, right? Not only am I enjoying this, but do I get a sense of, here's who this author is, here's why they're writing this book, and here's why no one else could tell the story that they're telling, right? I really want to feel the person in the manuscript as I'm reading it. And it has to be something that I vibe with, that I connect with, right? In terms of like, we have shared common interests. And, I think I'm always going to be best at representing books that I feel very deeply and very passionately about. And so without that connection to the why of the book, I tend not to go for those projects. It's why, like, most of the fiction I represent tends to be a little darker, tends to be a little bit more serious, tends to have a political component. Those kind of things are things that I just resonate with as a person, right? So that's sort of the first step of the threshold. And then once you're at that point, it comes down to connection, communication style, and just kind of vibe on some level. You you ideally are going to be working with this person for decades to come, right? In success, you know, one or both of you retires, and that's the end of the relationship. Doesn't always happen. It's very common to switch agents. Like, that's not a big deal. It's not a career ender in any way. People, I think, get more stressed out about it than is required. But still, when you're finding an agent, you're aiming for that success. You're aiming for the very long-term, decades-long relationship. So what you want to think about is this person a good business partner to me? Do their ethics align with mine? Does how they conduct their business feel good to me, right? more specifically, that can mean this person is very aggressive in business negotiation. You might feel I'm very timid. I'm not very good at negotiating for myself. I want a bulldog, right? I want somebody who's going to get in the publisher's face, be aggressive, really push for things. Or you might be somebody who doesn't like that energy and would rather have someone who operates more collaboratively, is more conversational, is gentler in certain ways, right? So knowing who does business in a way that you can vibe with is really important. And then the most important thing probably is communication style, right? Do you two communicate in a way where you're hearing each other, understanding each other in a clear, open way, right? Do I feel comfortable reaching out to my agent on a frequent basis, or do I have some hesitation about that because we're not clicking, I'm not understanding them, they're not understanding me, those kind of things. So frequency, communication, mode, style, tone, all of those things are super important. You need to click as people because ideally you're going to be very close business partners for a long time. So think about those things. That's really one of the things I'm looking at when I've gotten past the point of I'm interested in this book. This person seems like they would have an interesting career. Now, is this someone I can work with and want to work with? And do they want to work with me? Right. And am I just an agent to them, or are we excited about doing a thing together? That to me is really where the rubber really meets the road.
Those are
If
really
that,
good points.
yeah.
Right fit is important. That's what we always hear in publishing, right? Or any
Exactly.
manuscript or anything.
Yeah. I mean, you hear it all the time. Rejection letters constantly would be like, it wasn't the right fit. And it could feel dismissive. It could feel like a blow off at a certain point, but it's genuinely not. There's so many things I read that are great. And I'm just like, it's not the right fit. I'm not the right person for this. I might like the book, but I don't have a vision for how to publish it. That positioning isn't clear to me, right? The how to edit it isn't clear to me. I can see potential, but not a road. And that's the point at which I'm like, I'm not the right person.
Yeah. And I remember like when I first started querying, I would get letters from agents saying like, I don't know how to sell your book, right? I don't have the connections
Yeah.
for this, right? This is
Yeah.
great, but, and I think that's what it really means. It doesn't mean your work is not good, right? It's
Yeah.
just the person is not sure how to go
Yeah.
forward.
Constantly. I just had a conversation with a writer 2 days ago about somebody who I'm thinking about taking on, and she just works in an area I don't have a lot of experience in. I'm very excited about what she's doing. I think she's brilliant and talented, but it really is a genuine conversation between us of like, can I figure out how to do the thing that she wants to do, and is she comfortable working with someone who doesn't have a deep track record in this space, right? And so it's a constant question, and I bring it up to illustrate how much it's a question for me, but also how much the power's in her court too to make a decision for herself about what's right for her career. And I think it could work out. Obviously, I wouldn't be talking to her if I didn't, but I totally understand and respect that she has a very difficult call to make about whether or not she trusts me to figure out this category and to take on her work when I don't have a proven track record in that space.
Yeah, it can be a scary thing, right? Because you're trusting someone with your manuscript
Yeah.
and then they're sending it out. And then sometimes you
Yep.
only have one chance with a publisher, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
For sure. And some students were worried about automatic faux pas when querying and meeting
Yeah.
agents. So, what is something in a potential client or their query letter or manuscript that makes it an automatic rejection for you?
Yeah.
I'm just.
This threshold is much lower than people think it is. The threshold for like not being an automatic reject, it's the bar is very low because I get some wild emails that the level of just general insanity that happens in my inbox or when I go to a conference is incredibly high. So to not fit into that category, it's not hard to clear that, right? Don't be rude, like I'm a person, treat me like a human being. Don't walk up to an agent and immediately start pitching. Have a conversation, right? Treat them like a person and you greet them in the way that you would greet anybody, right? So when I get on my back foot, it's because I feel like I'm being treated like a book deal dispensing machine and not a person who exists in the world and is here trying to have a nice time. You know what I mean? And so I think that's just the first step is approach an agent with the same openness and generosity that you would approach anybody in your life, right? I understand that it can be very nervous. You don't want to take up a lot of their time, but a simple "Hi, how are you? My name is so and so" is really all you need to do. Same thing in a query letter. Don't be hostile. Don't be rude. I can't tell you how many query letters I get that are like, "I've written a young adult novel, but it's not like those other trash young adult novels. This one's actually good." And it's like, I work in this field. You know that I like those books, right? That's why I do this, right? Or they'll, like talk down science fiction. And I'm like, this is my job. You're talking down my peers and my friends and the books that I love. So don't come in with hostile, negative energy. Come in with a positive energy. Be open, be friendly. One of my colleagues, Kate McKean, also has a really wonderful publishing newsletter that I recommend called, I think it's just called Agents and Books. It's great. She wrote a newsletter a while back that like really kind of blew my mind because she's so spot on. And it was about query letters. And the whole point she made was do less. When you write a query letter, do the bare minimum. You're not trying to impress me by being so brilliant and so crazy and so innovative in how you present your letter. That's not going to catch my attention. What you want to do is be simple and be clear and direct. And indicate that you will be good to work with, that we will enjoy communicating with each other, right? And so what you want to do is just write a very basic query letter that introduces who you are, tells me a little bit about the book, give me the pitch, tell me your bio, and get out. And that's it, right? Like simplicity and clarity is way more important than trying to be flashy and impressive. Don't write it in a character voice, right? Don't do something complicated in your structure. Don't send it on perfumed letter full of glitter. You know what I mean? Like no one sends physical ones anymore, but back in the day, this used to happen every now and again. Like basically, like once a month, you would open a query letter, and then your desk would just be inundated with glitter, and you'd be furious for the rest of the month. Don't do things like that, right? Whatever the digital equivalent of that is. The
Mhm.
thing to think about query letters is that agents have a workflow. We're seeing hundreds of these at a time, usually. And when we have requirements, it's because we have a specific process, and you want to fit into that process as neatly and smoothly as you can. Because what you want to do is not be a problem for us. You want to be a solution for us. We want to say yes, right? We want to find things that we're excited to work on. And so if you lead with that possibility, if you lead with that openness, then I think that's the thing that's going to get you across the line. So when it comes to a query letter, think about doing the bare minimum. Think about keeping it very simple, adhering to whatever guidelines we've asked for, depending on the agent, to make sure and look those up. And then when you meet an agent in person, just remember that we're people too, and that I'm going to respond best to a real conversation and a real connection. I'm not going to remember if you just walked up and pitched me and walked away. So that's my general advice. It's not hard to not piss us off. Just be nice, I
Mhm.
guess is what I would say.
Yes, it's amazing how many people are so strange at these conferences. Like it's simply like they forget that we're
Yeah,
all people. Yeah.
it can be wild. I mean,
Yeah.
we all have stories about being chased into the bathroom by a writer with a manuscript, or, like just know your moment. If I'm trying to do my business, don't come talk to me. Don't interrupt me if I'm on a phone call. If I'm in the middle of a conversation, I'm clearly in the middle of a conversation. Those kind of things. It's just basic politeness.
Mhm. Those are great tips. And just moving on back to spec fiction. So
Mhm.
in Canada, I guess in the States, we're also seeing this abundance of spec fic by and about people from marginalized communities. And given the ways that LGBTQ and BIPOC and disabled peoples have been represented in more traditional spec texts, despite efforts of writers like Toni Morrison, Larissa Lai, Octavia Butler, can you talk about how more recent spec fic writers are shaping political and aesthetic areas of these genres? You talked a
Yeah, I
little bit
mean,
about chlorine as well.
totally.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think marginalized writers really gravitate towards speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror, all these things, because, you know, I think to tell our stories, sometimes when you're trying to tell your story and the dominant readership is not somebody who intrinsically understands your experience, who has lived your experience, sees it, or, literally, if you are marginalized, then you are on the margins, right? So to reach that audience, it requires an act of imagination and an act of like a stretching of empathy and imagination on the part of your audience. And so sometimes speculative is a great way to get there, right? When I think the reason we saw this wave of horror take off really from marginalized writers, Black writers, Indigenous writers, queer writers, all of this have really driven this wave of horror that we've seen recently. And it's because, the experience of being Black in America, of being queer in this country, of being an Asian American, all these things are very fraught, and sometimes the material of our lives will feel like a horror novel to people who haven't lived those experiences, right? Um, and the same is true when it comes to dystopian fiction or heroic fantasy or these kind of things, is to write about a world in which race isn't your race and your identity is a more dominant part of the culture or isn't actively marginalized or whatever it happens to be. It requires an active imagination of a world that is not the one that we live in, right? And so I think speculative fiction is such a draw to people who are coming from these marginalized backgrounds, because we already live lives that require those acts of imagination to exist on a day-to-day basis, to live in places that are actively hostile to us, actively violent to us, that aren't accepting and welcoming of us. We are already daily doing the work of imagining a world that isn't the one that we live in, simply to exist and survive. So yeah, when it comes to write your story, then, I think speculative feels like a really natural fit. It really feels natural to be like, hey, I'm going to write a dystopian story. I'm Octavia Butler. I'm going to write a dystopian story about the collapse of America, because that's the world I live in. That's the thing I experience. That's the thing I can so easily envision, right? I mean, I'm speaking for her, obviously, in this case, but, and then that can be such an iconic vision. I mean, Butler's work has been a guiding light for activist spaces in the United States for decades, right? There's so many Black and brown activists who look at her work as a model for how to resist, how to envision a different world, right? And so all of these things, you can see speculative fiction is fundamentally about the world that we live in. And so I think to get that sense of representing our experiences accurately and in depth and openly does require that extra active imagination.
Yeah, that is so right. And I always say, when you write nonfiction as like a woman of color, you're like writing a horror movie in
Yeah.
itself, right?
Yeah. And how often do you try to tell somebody a story about a thing that happened? You're like, that didn't happen, or like, it couldn't be that bad, or like, I'm sure that that's not happening to you all the time. And it's like, no, these things happen to me on a regular basis. And so when you're met with disbelief at just trying to tell the factual elements of your life, sometimes it's like, okay, fine, I'll make it a horror story, and then you'll buy it, then you'll believe it, right? And that's why we see, something like Get Out blow up and resonate in the way that it does, right? Because it is fundamentally about assimilation and the kind of discrimination that Black people face on a day-to-day basis. But you have to put it in this setting. You have to make it extra and big and speculative to get people to engage with it in that way.
Mhm. So interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the past, certain contributions of spec fic, they had a bad reputation for appropriating experiences of BIPOC experiences. And they, reiterated harmful racial and ethnic
Mhm.
stereotypes. What advice that you have for emerging BIPOC spec fic authors who want to resist these problematic texts and their legacies?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, it's a big topic. We've seen a lot of appropriation, a lot of using other cultures as set decoration, as exotic flair for whatever world that people are creating, whether that's Orientalism and cyberpunk, whether that's, racist caricatures in Star Wars or whatever it is, right? This is a thing that we see in genre fiction over and over and over again. And so I think as we go forward in imagining what science fiction and fantasy could be for the future, what speculative fiction could be for the future, I think really interrogating what are we trying to say when we're putting someone into a story, when putting a culture into a story. And, have I really considered what the lived experience of these people are, right? Now, the challenge is that when you're writing these, you're always going to be writing from perspectives that aren't your lived experience, right? If you want to represent any kind of diversity, any kind of range of culture, any kind of range of experience, you have to be writing perspectives that aren't ones that you grew up with, right? And so that can be a real challenge when writing these kind of stories. And so I don't want to discourage white writers from writing characters of color. That's a nightmare. If a white writer only writes other white characters, that's not good either, right? And so I think we need to find ways to have real conversations about what is good representation, what is harmful representation. And really, that comes down to two things in my book. One is doing your homework, understanding what the stereotypes about a particular culture are, and then just avoiding them, like just easily doing an end run around anything that's like an obvious trope that has been used in harmful ways in the past. There will be things that you won't be aware of. This isn't going to be fully comprehensive, but at least try, right? At least do your basic research, right? And then the second thing that is the thing that will truly save you from getting into trouble, that will truly save you from stepping into a territory or saying something you didn't mean to, is specificity, right? When this becomes problematic is when people feel like they're making broad statements about all people of this culture, all people with this disability, all people with this experience behave like this. What you want instead to be doing is this person comes from this family in this place and they had this experience and this is how that person reacts. The more specific you are about what we're engaging with, the less problematic it'll be in our reading of that, right? Where it becomes problematic is when it feels like a broad brush and suddenly everyone's like, well, my experience, it wasn't like that. Why are you talking about that? But anything you're talking about, somebody's experience was the thing that you were talking about, right? Even if it does conform to what could be a hurtful stereotype, provided you're providing a range of examples and you're treating those people like truly with the seriousness that you would treat your white protagonist, or if you're, an Asian writer, then your Asian protagonist, whatever it is, right? You know, this is certainly an issue among BIPOC community as well. We are not immune to this, to failing at representation. But, for me, I think the answer is always about specificity. It's always about leaning into the concrete ways that we can understand somebody's experience and understand um, the nuances and complexities of the world that they live in.
That is so helpful. We have that conversation, I think, almost every semester. Students come up to me and ask, is it okay if I write like this? Is it okay? And we have to sit down. And I think you just
Yeah.
articulated that perfectly. Thank you.
It's really tough. I mean, people come up to me all the time like, is it okay that I did X, Y, A, and Z? And I'm like, I don't have a stamp of authenticity that's gonna like clear you, right? I don't know. You might be asking me about a South Asian character or, indigenous character. I can't speak for that. I can't even speak for all other Korean Americans. I can speak for myself and what feels good and what feels bad to me, right? And, I think the reality is if you are publishing a book, some people aren't going to like it. That's always going to be true. Your book isn't for everyone. The question is, are a bunch of people saying this was hurtful to me for a specific reason? And then the question for you is, what do you want to do about that? Do you want to listen to that or do you want to ignore that? And that is your call. And the consequences of doing one or the other exist in the world. We live in a complex society. I don't know that all these decisions that have been made in terms of representation are good ones or bad ones. I'm not a moral arbiter here either, right? And I think it really comes down to each of us in making art, in putting work into the world. People will respond to that in certain ways, and you have to have a relationship to that. You have to have an understanding of that one way or the other.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots to think about.
It's a big, complicated one.
It
Yeah, for
is.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no easy answers here.
Yeah, good for discussion. So going back again to marketing and literary fiction. So in Canada, and I don't know if this is true in the States, festivals, they tend to favor literary fiction and they downplay the speculative elements of a book. And I also think, this is somewhat true of prizes and marketing. So why do you think some speculative books are marketed as more literary and others don't receive the same treatment? I mean, going back again to positionality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough one with lots of complicated reasons, right? part of it is marketing, right? Part of it is just, who is this book for, right? And then we have a certain bias in our culture about what is commercial fiction versus what is literary fiction, right? What is worthy for purely artistic merit versus what is books that are being sold to make money, right? So you look at something like Fourth Wing, people are not saying this is high art that is being created for the sake of making art. And so they're not going to feature Rebecca Yarros at, the a Penn Literary Festival or the Brooklyn Book Fair or whatever it is, right? Now, does that make sense as a divide? I don't know. I don't think so, right? Like, I think Twilight did more to influence people's lives and aesthetic tastes than, you know, any Cormac McCarthy book, right? Like, I don't know if that's good or bad, but I do think it's like fundamentally true, right? And so I think a literary festival is often seen as a way of promoting things that people decide deserve to be promoted and don't have an audience. And that, or have an audience that should be bigger, right? And so I think that's a little bit the balancing it. That's the logic of it. I think that logic is incredibly flawed because I think that automatically assumes that anything with speculative element, anything is purely written for commercial purposes and not for artistic purposes. I think that's incredibly short-sighted and limiting in terms of what is being published. I mean, as you're mentioning, so much of marginalized authors are writing in those speculative spaces. And so if we're painting with a broad brush, then you're automatically cutting out a huge swath of the readership or the potential authors who could be at your festival representing different cultures, representing different points of view, simply because they're not writing quote unquote contemporary realist literary fiction, right? So I think that's a very long answer to just saying that, like, we have a traditional divide between what is like worthy and what is not, and it's sort of a highbrow, lowbrow split. I think we're seeing that break down somewhat as we're seeing more and more people who are traditionally considered literary writers writing speculative fiction, whether that's Colson Whitehead or Kazuo Shiguro, or all these people who are turning to more speculative elements in their work even after they've been established. I mean, even Cormac McCarthy wrote a dystopian novel, right? A post-apocalyptic novel. So, I think we're seeing that break down to some extent, but people still love to fight about this. They love to be resentful of, those commercial authors who are making so much money, and genre authors love to be resentful about, the literary novelists who were rude to them and looked down on their work or whatever it is. I find these debates to be incredibly tedious, but the reality is that they do matter. Who gets nominated for awards matter. Who gets to be at a festival matter. Who gets a grant to write matters, right? Who gets a residency. All these things are big questions that I think if we approached things with less of an eye about genre category and more just focused on the writing and the storytelling, I think we'd live in a better world.
Mm-hmm. I like that idea. No, I wish there was not that distinction, because
Yeah.
I'm someone who, who's really interested in merging both, right? And I think a lot
Yeah.
of my contemporaries are.
Same. And, I've really built my career at that intersection of stuff that could go on either side of the line. And so I find having to make that decision often very frustrating or limiting, or, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so difficult. Being a writer is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Making art is very complicated. Selling art is very complicated. Yeah, no matter what the medium is.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And what are some strategies that up and coming and even more experienced writers could use if they feel the pressure to make their writing more literary? Or on the other hand, what would you tell writers who either, consider themselves literary, and were trained to write, in literary style if they went to a BFA or MFA program, but, they're drawn to speculative genres?
I think the key is to strip out people's expectations from you and write the thing that feels best to you, right? And that's much easier said than done. One thing I talk about is, if you want to be a published author, you'll have two separate careers. One is as a writer, and then the second is as a publisher, as a published author, right? The second is all the professional skills. And that's when you start worrying about, what does the market want? How do we position this? How do we market it? How do I find an agent? How do I network? All that shit goes into the published author side. Try not to think about this stuff when you're drafting. Try not to think about that stuff when you're writing, when you're coming up with the idea of a book. Think about what makes sense to you, what's the voice you want to be writing, and what's best for the story you're trying to tell. Having a compelling vision is always going to matter more than writing in the correct category at the right time, right? That sometimes means you will write a book that is not marketable in today's market. That is a risk that you run. But the more you think about that while you're trying to come up with that idea, the more I think you're going to paralyze yourself creatively and end up with something that you don't love, right? And at the end of the day, if you write a book that you love and you don't sell it, you've at least written a book that you love. You've at least created something that matters to you. If you simply write something for the market and it doesn't sell, you literally have nothing at the end of the process. You have wasted your time. So I encourage you to not think about those things as much as possible. Put the voices of your professors out of your mind, put the voices of your peers out of your mind. Trust your unconscious, all that you've internalized over the years of practice, over those critique sessions, what you learned in class, what you absorbed through reading. Let that guide you in an unconscious way and focus on what feels good to you in the writing. And then when you're done with that, that's when you step back and look around and say, did I write a science fiction book or did I write a literary novel? Who's this for? Who wants to read this? What agent is the right agent? What publisher is the right publisher? That's when you start asking those questions. So protect your writing heart while you're actually writing is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good advice because you'll never get that being a writer back, right? Once you
Nope.
publish, it's always like
Yeah.
that, navigating
Yeah.
between the two, right? Your first book
Yeah.
is the one that you get to hide and write.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Exactly. And even when you're writing your second book or your third book, try to separate that and close that off as much as you can. It gets harder because you have a lot of emails you have to answer and publicity to do and all this stuff. But you know, really, I try to encourage my clients to protect their writing as much as they can. It's
Mhm.
hard.
It's hard, yeah, but it's
Yeah.
really good advice. You also have a newsletter. Publishing is hard. Can you talk a
Mhm.
little bit about that and why was it something that you wanted to do? I know you always say you always like to help
Yeah.
people, and it's true, you do.
I do love to try and communicate how this industry works, right? I think a lot of people look at publishing and they're like, it's just craziness, right? It's just madness. They don't do anything that makes sense, or they're out to get us, or you'll see wild conspiracy theories about why publishers make the decisions that they do. So what I wanted to do was to communicate a little bit more of like how the business works, how do people make decisions, but also to communicate the experience on our side that our jobs are very hard and they're kind of heartbreaking a lot of the time too. So the title really is the point of the thing is that publishing is hard, not just for writers, but as people who work in publishing too, right? And so to give a little bit of a lens into the decisions that we're making, how we're making them, it's a very difficult line to walk. It's why I don't write these very often, because it can be really challenging to figure out how do I talk about an issue in a way that is honest and does reveal the things that I want to reveal, but doesn't, betray a client's confidence or expose a situation that, a lot of people don't like to see how messy it can be behind the scenes, right? And so I have to be very careful in writing these, but I do want to give people more insight into what the process is. And so, a lot of my audience are other publishing people as much as they are other writers. And it is just trying to communicate a little bit like what it's like to be on this side of the line. And then hopefully is as writers can see, then understand that they'll understand better how to interact with publishing, how to approach publishing, and how to realize that it's not all just arbitrary decisions that people are making for no reason. There's a logic to it, there are reasons for it, there's a structure to it, and there's history to it too. I mean, sometimes things are decided to be done a certain way because they used to be done that way and there are reasons why that used to be done that way. There's a million different ways in which I think the history of publishing and the process of it are can be quite confusing to an outsider. And so trying to clarify that as much as I can.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember I did not understand publishing at all until I actually interned.
Yeah.
I worked at I was an editor intern at Random House and then
Mhm.
ICM. And then you don't realize the volume and all
Yes.
these sorts of things that are happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Internships are
And so
helpful.
so when you're an individual writer, you can't see all that. You don't understand that they're making a decision about 10 books at once. And so yours got caught in that. And that doesn't make it okay that yours got caught in that, but that's a little bit what's happening. So then it's like, okay, what can I do about that now or next time? What's worth resisting? What's worth fighting? What's a winnable fight versus what's not, and those are things to think about.
Yeah. Often, book stuff decisions, it feels personal, but it isn't, right, to the
Yeah,
writer. It's
exactly.
something good to
Exactly.
think about.
Yeah.
Um, Can you talk about some of the projects that you're currently working on? Any current and upcoming releases? Are you allowed to talk about that?
Yeah. What am I allowed to talk about right now? I feel like I have a lot of stuff in process that I can't talk about that I'm like, can we please announce this project so I can start talking about it? We have a new horror novel from Chuck Tingle coming up this summer. His first novel was a USA Today bestseller. And so he has a new novel coming out this summer called Bury Your Gaze. That is, again, a very queer horror novel. He is currently having some fun with the Texas Library Association, who just rescinded an invitation for him to give a talk at the conference. So that is a situation that's currently going on. And let's see, what else do I have coming up? I have a queer YA horror novel from Nino Cipri coming out, I believe, this fall. That's very exciting. And I'm truly blanking on everything that I have in the pipeline right now. Oh, I have a middle grade novel from Marcus Shiro coming out called Jasmine is Haunted. That's a very sweet story about a young girl who, as the title might indicate, is haunted and keeps being pursued by ghosts. Yeah, so I got a bunch in the pipeline, and then some very exciting stuff that I can't quite talk about yet. So
Great. Now these sound all really good. Summer reading list. Yeah.
excellent. I hope you enjoy.
Mhm. There's some questions from students who want to know about what the spec market is like right now for adult and
Mhm.
YA, and what are editors specifically looking for?
Uh, the thing everyone's talking about right now in adult speculative fiction is romantasy. Again, this is Fourth Wing, so it's there's a lot of interest in the intersection between romance and fantasy genres. Um, Fourth Wing is dominated the conversation for the last 6 months. It is an absolute juggernaut. So I think that is going to be defining the field for a while. Cozy fantasy is also very popular right now. Cozy's been doing extremely well, whether that's TJ Klune or Travis Baldree. I think people really are looking for that in the fantasy and science fiction space too, with Becky Chambers. So I think on the adult side, that's really driving things at the moment. Horror is still having its moment. I think we're still going to see quite an appetite for horror. So we're both going very cozy, romantic, and also very dark and horror. And then the YA market is very much in flux right now, and I have no idea which way it's going. I think it feels a little disorganized at the moment. I'm a little bit waiting to sort of see where the tea leaves settle to get a better sense of what's going on there. The adult SFF market was also pretty disruptive for a while, and only now is like really crystallizing into like horror and romantasy. That's or romantasy and cozy. That's where we're going right now. So it's a little everything's in flux at the moment. The general trend is because of the changes at Barnes and Noble, in particular in the US, um, really leaning towards big books, more established things. So if you're a debut, really think about how to be sort of splashy, how to have a bigger impact, how to make sure that aiming for mid list is just not a thing that exists anymore. You have to be aiming for the bestseller list. You have to be shooting really for shooting for the stars when you're going out there with your first project. So, even more than ever, I think the pressure on debuts is quite high.
Yeah, it's terrifying now.
Yeah. Sorry, I know that's not the most delightful news to hear for a bunch of starting out writers, but people still get there every day. I mean, people still break through, blow up. It's definitely possible. It's definitely doable. It's harder than it has been in a minute, but hopefully those marketing conditions will change too. We'll see.
Fingers crossed.
Exactly.
Mhm. I think we have time for maybe one or two more
Sure.
questions. Someone is asking, would you advise querying a ghost story as horror, even if it fits more into the suspense or mystery?
It depends really on tone, right? I mean, there's a whole category of thrillers that's supernatural thriller, right? So if it is more of a thriller, then maybe saying it's a speculative thriller or has a thriller with supernatural elements or whatever it is might be a slightly better way to go. But horror is hot right now. So in general, I would lean more towards the horror side. But if fundamentally, tonally, content wise, the resolution feels more like a thriller suspense resolution than a horror one, i.e., like the heroes are more successful, they get away, they solve the crime, whatever it is, then maybe just call it what it is. And suspense might be a better category for it. So just because there's a ghost doesn't automatically mean it's horror. I would really interrogate where you feel like you fit and then go out with it wherever you feel like it best fits in the market.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And this question is about digital publishing and artificial intelligence. So what type of recognized influence of digital publishing and AI, what type of work can writers and editors expect to find in the near future? Do writers still have jobs?
I do think writers will still have jobs. I think the thing that's going to be hardest hit by AI is sort of the lower end of the copywriting market, right? I know a lot of people who are getting started in writing have made a good living as copywriters, finding work on freelance sites and working for different brands. I think is the thing that's getting pushed out by AI very rapidly in a way that's pretty upsetting to watch. I think fiction is still going to be quite resistant to AI. I think we're probably going to see one or two splashy AI novels. I think Hachette's already doing one. I don't remember the details of it. It sounded dumb to me, but I think there will be ones just trying to be edgy and cool. But I think people will quickly find that what we want is to be reading stories from people. That the sort of regurgitation that AI can do is not going to be a satisfying reading experience. Now, we will probably see a bunch of AI generated novels sort of absorbing the low end of the indie market that are being published very quickly, trying to hit certain tropes, trying to hit a certain short, readable, cheap books at the $1.99 price point below. I think that might be impacted by this. If you're considering traditional physical book publishing, you'll probably not need to worry about it too much. It is still very stressful to hear about. Contractually, it's something we're really keeping an eye on. We're really pressuring publishers to put guarantees against, using AI models in any direction on these projects. Publishers are, actively looking at using AI tools in-house to generate plot summaries or copy or things like that. I think fundamentally these efforts are not going to be very successful in the short term, at least. So I think there's a future for writers. I think people are always going to want human stories told by humans. But I'm not a techno optimist. I'm pretty pessimistic about technology in a lot of ways. And, or it might be just hopeful that I have a career in 10 years. So we'll see.
Hopeful. I hope so. We all need
Yeah,
our careers.
exactly. But it's a great question.
Yeah, thank you everyone for submitting questions. It looks like we're out of time. And I just want to thank you, DongWon, so much for coming here. I know you're really busy and just giving us such like a wonderful rundown of publishing and
These were
spec
such
fiction.
fantastic questions. You all had really wonderful, really nuanced, interesting questions. And it was so good to see you. And it was such a pleasure to be here and talk about all this stuff.
Thank you so much. We should all clap and hear us. And we should all be signing up for your newsletter. And you're online on, I guess, no one uses Twitter anymore, I guess.
You mostly find me on Instagram at this point. And I think I'm just at DongWon_ or something like that. So I'm there. You can find me on my website, dongwonsong.com, and then sign up for the newsletter, publishingisHard.com. Oh, and I'm also on the podcast Writing Excuses, so you can find me there every week too, if you want a little writing advice every week. So,
and that's just a great podcast, and that's how I think we met on that conference.
Yes, the Writing Excuses retreat. So, yeah. But thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was terrific. I'm going to stop recording now.